So King Charles just opened the car trunk of Queen Camilla's son in the middle of a palace banquet and found Princess Diana's private confidential letters hidden inside. And the second Prince William caught his father standing over those files, he laid down an ultimatum that literally shook the monarchy to its core. And honestly, when you hear the ridiculous excuse Tom gave for having those papers, you'll understand why William went completely nuclear. Before we get into the exact receipts and how this went down, hit subscribe real quick to Crown Watch so you don't miss our weekly breakdowns of what really happens behind closed palace doors. Alright, let's start with what actually happened in that courtyard, because the whole thing is wild from start to finish. So it all kicked off at approximately 11:45 at night, inside the inner cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace. The grand state banquet was just wrapping up. We are talking about the kind of high-profile evening where every single detail is rehearsed to perfection, with world leaders, foreign ambassadors, and senior royals gathering under the massive crystal chandeliers. King Charles had spent the entire evening playing the gracious host, showing the world that his reign was steady and secure. But as the final guests began filtering out into the cool London air, Charles excused himself from Camilla, stepped past his royal protection team, and walked out into the courtyard just to get a brief breath of fresh air. Now the courtyard at night is usually completely dead, quiet, lined with dark, luxury sedans, waiting for high-profile guests. But as Charles walked along the flagstones, something caught his eye that immediately felt off. A sleek black car belonging to Camilla's son, Tom Parker Bowles, was parked near the side entrance. And the trunk lid wasn't fully closed. It was sitting open by just a couple of inches. Now, if you know anything about palace protocol, you know that security on these grounds is tighter than anywhere else in the entire country. Nothing is ever left unsealed or unmonitored. Every vehicle that passes through those iron gates is checked, logged, and cleared. So seeing an unlatched car trunk sitting open in the middle of a major state event was an instant red flag. Charles frowned, walked over, and lifted the trunk lid the rest of the way up. And what he saw, sitting under a dark piece of cloth, made his heart stop. Inside that trunk were stacks of vintage leather folders and legal-sized envelopes bound together with heavy red cotton string. They were stamped with official seals from government administrative officers. And sitting right on top, placed almost like it was waiting to be noticed, was a thick tan folder with dark, bold lettering across the cover, Diana, Confidential. Charles literally staggered back. People who saw him in those few seconds said his face turned completely pale, like all the colour had been drained out of him in a single moment. He reached out with a trembling hand, lifted the top folder, and pulled out a handwritten letter. He recognised the penmanship instantly. It was the elegant, looping handwriting of Princess Diana, written during some of the absolute darkest months of her life inside the royal family. And right at that exact second, before Charles could even process what he was holding, heavy footsteps echoed across the cobblestones behind him. It was Prince William. He had stepped outside looking for his father, saw Charles standing over the open trunk, and walked straight over. When William looked down into that trunk and saw his mother's name stamped across those government folders, the atmosphere in that courtyard didn't just shift. It completely froze. There were no raised voices at first. There was no theatrical screaming. It was just this terrifying, heavy silence. People nearby described William's face changing instantly, from routine fatigue to total unadulterated fury. His jaw locked. His eyes narrowed, and he looked at his father with a level of cold rage that no one had ever seen from him in public before. Like, think about that scenario for a second. Imagine walking out of a white-tie royal banquet where you've spent 3 hours pretending everything is perfect, only to catch your father standing over your stepbrother's car trunk, filled with your late mother's most private guarded secrets. That is not just an awkward family moment. That is an absolute institutional nuclear bomb going off in the dark. William looked at Charles, looked down at the folders, and asked a single quiet question that cut through the night air like a knife. "Father, what are those papers doing in Tom's car?" And before Charles could formulate a single word of explanation, Tom Parker Bowles stepped out from the side doors of the palace, holding a glass of scotch, completely unaware that his entire world was about to collapse around him. And what happened next? Nobody saw it coming. Now, before we get into the massive argument that broke out right there on the cobblestones, we need to pause and break down what was actually inside those folders, because when you understand what was at stake, you realise why William reacted with such absolute fury. We are not talking about old newspaper clippings or public magazine interviews that anyone can buy on eBay. We are talking about primary unredacted historical records that had been missing from official palace archives for over 2 decades. Inside those bound folders were handwritten personal diaries kept by Princess Diana between 1993 and 1996. They contained her private daily reflections during the absolute ugliest phases of her separation from Charles. There were detailed personal notes outlining her fears about state surveillance, private letters written directly to her closest legal advisors, and confidential security dossiers, compiled by senior government officials during the height of the media war between the households. These were documents that carried the power to completely shatter the carefully constructed public image that Clarence House had spent 20 years building for King Charles and Queen Camilla. And then came the explanation from Tom Parker Bowles. When William turned on him and demanded to know why those private files were sitting in the back of his car, Tom didn't offer a clever legal excuse. He basically stumbled over his words and claimed that the papers had been given to him by a private manuscript broker for a book project. A book project. Let that sink in for a second. Tom Parker Bowles is a food critic. He writes about luxury restaurants' reviews, artisan cheeses, and publishes cookbooks about traditional English roasts. He is not an investigative historian. He is not a biographer. He is not a legal archivist. And we are honestly expected to believe that classified government files and Diana's private handwritten correspondence just casually landed in the trunk of a food writer's car as background material for a literary project. Like, let's be totally real for a second. That explanation is so absurd, it actually borders on insulting. Sensitive royal documents do not simply float around the rare manuscript market, waiting for food critics to pick them up. If a private dealer actually possessed original handwritten letters from Princess Diana, those papers would be worth millions of pounds on the private international market. They would be taken to elite auction houses behind non-disclosure agreements or sold quietly to private collectors in New York or Switzerland. They wouldn't be handed off to the Queen Consort's son to help him outline a chapter for a new book. Think about what that actually means. Either Tom honestly believed that William and Charles were foolish enough to swallow a story about a cookbook research project, or something far more calculated was happening behind the scenes. If those papers were sitting in his car trunk during a major state banquet inside Buckingham Palace, it meant they were being actively moved. They were in transit. And to William, that detail changed everything. If those documents were being moved through palace grounds using private civilian vehicles, it meant that Princess Diana's most intimate, painful memories were being treated like a tradable commodity. It meant that people operating in the margins of Camilla's family were handling confidential files that belonged exclusively to Diana's direct heirs. We are not talking about a casual family misunderstanding over an old photo album here. We are talking about the potential commercial exploitation of a dead mother's private grief by the exact family that replaced her. And when William applied legal and personal pressure to that paper trail, Tom's story completely disintegrated within minutes. But to truly understand why the sight of those specific folders filled William with such cold, terrifying resolve, you have to look at the 20-year wound he had been carrying in silence ever since he was a teenager. To really get why, William was ready to tear down the palace walls that night. You have to go back more than 20 years and look at what he was forced to endure as a young man. Most people see William today as the polished, disciplined Prince of Wales. He smiles for the cameras, attends state dinners, performs his public duties, and acts as the steady anchor of the modern monarchy. But beneath that flawless public exterior is a man who spent his entire adult life swallowing deep personal pain for the sake of an institution that didn't always protect him back. When Princess Diana died in 1997, William was just 15 years old. He was a boy forced to walk behind his mother's coffin in front of millions of television viewers while maintaining a stiff upper lip. And in the years that followed, as he grew up and went to university, he watched something unfold behind closed doors that turns your stomach when you really think about it. He watched as the palace machinery slowly, methodically rebranded Camilla Parker Bowles from the most criticised woman in Britain into a respected senior royal. Now William understood the institutional necessity of that transformation. He knew his father needed stability, and he knew the monarchy needed to move past the scandals of the 1990s. So William played the dutiful son. He posed for the family photographs. He stood beside Camilla at official events. He attended her family gatherings, and he never once uttered a single word of public criticism about his stepmother or her children. He played the game perfectly for over 2 decades. But while William was maintaining that polite silence, Camilla's extended family was quietly weaving itself into the fabric of royal life. Her son Tom and her daughter Laura were granted informal access to private estate properties. They were given parking privileges at royal residences, invited to confidential family gatherings, and allowed to operate in the comfortable shadow of the sovereign's inner circle. They enjoyed all the prestige and access of royal life, without any of the constitutional scrutiny or public accountability that William had to carry every single day. And for 20 years, William watched Tom Parker Bowles navigate palace circles with an easy, casual confidence. To the public, Tom was just a charming food writer who happened to be the Queen's son. But to William, Tom was the living, walking reminder of the affair that had destroyed his mother's marriage, fractured his childhood, and haunted his family for a generation. Every time Tom laughed at a private family dinner, every time he walked through the private corridors of Highgrove or Buckingham Palace, like he owned the place, William had to sit there, bite his tongue, and pretend everything was completely fine. He was forced to watch the people who had benefited from his mother's misery enjoy the perks of her former home. So when William stood in that courtyard at 11:45 at night and looked into the trunk of Tom's car, he didn't just see a folder of documents. He saw 20 years of disrespect hitting a breaking point. He realised that while he had been sacrificing his own feelings to protect his father's happiness, Camilla's circle had grown so comfortable, so arrogant in their proximity to power, that they thought they could drive around with Princess Diana's private papers in their trunk without anyone ever daring to call them out. That wasn't just a security breach to William. That was a direct insult to his mother's memory. It was proof that the polite promises made to him as a grieving teenager had been completely ignored. The second people thought he wasn't looking, and what William decided to do in that courtyard proved that the dutiful, quiet prince was officially done playing nice. Now let's break down the exact commercial scheme that was being put together behind the scenes, because when you look at the paper trail that William's legal team uncovered over the following 48 hours, the sheer scale of it was staggering. And honestly, it came dangerously close to being pulled off. Back in the early months of the year, an independent literary broker operating through an offshore agency based in Dublin began making quiet inquiries among major international publishing houses. The proposal was built around an upcoming major royal anniversary. The selling point was not just another opinion piece or a collection of standard royal commentaries. The proposal promised access to previously unreleased primary source material, detailing the private thoughts, personal fears, and legal strategies of Princess Diana during her final years inside the monarchy. The projected valuation attached to this multi-platform media deal was £3.2 million. We are talking about a massive international publishing package, including serialization rights for major American networks, print rights for global newspapers, and a companion documentary series, to execute a deal of that magnitude without triggering automatic alarms inside the royal estate. The managers of the scheme needed a way to move physical documents out of storage, verify their authenticity with private buyers, and transfer them without leaving a paper trail in official palace registries. And that is where their security loophole came in. As the son of the Queen Consort, Tom Parker, Bowles possessed a permanent private security pass for his vehicle. That pass allowed his car to enter the gates of Buckingham Palace, Clarence House, and Sandringham, without being subjected to standard physical boot inspections or detailed cargo logging by security teams. While every commercial delivery van, media vehicle and staff car had to go through rigorous explosive and contraband scans at the gate, a vehicle carrying Camilla's son was simply waved through by guards who recognised him on sight. It was the ultimate administrative blind spot. The scheme relied on the fact that nobody inside palace security would ever dare to ask the Queen's son to pop his trunk. They counted on the idea that social deference and family privilege would provide total cover for moving sensitive physical archives off palace grounds. And ask yourself this, why was the trunk unlatched on that specific night? Because the timing was calculated to exploit the chaos of a major state event. During a grand banquet involving dozens of foreign dignitaries, palace security is entirely focused on external perimeter threats, motorcade arrivals, and high-level protection detail. The internal courtyards are busy, cars are constantly being moved by valets, and staff members are rushing back and forth. It was the absolute perfect cover for a quiet document handoff. They assumed that King Charles would be trapped inside the ballroom, making speeches until midnight. They assumed William would be occupied with international guests. They assumed that by the time the banquet ended, the car would be gone, the files would be in a private safe in Mayfair, and nobody in the royal family would ever realise those folders were missing from the archive rooms. They thought they had planned for every possible variable, but they made one catastrophic mistake. They failed to account for a tired king stepping outside for 5 minutes of fresh air, and they completely underestimated the cold, lethal speed with which Prince William would react when he saw his mother's name on that tan folder. The scheme was one step away from clearing £3.2 million, and William was about to shut it down in front of the entire world. When William confronted Tom in that courtyard, Tom tried to play it down. He put on that relaxed, easygoing charm that had worked for him in social circles for years. He laughed nervously, raised his hands and said it was all a massive misunderstanding. He claimed he was just keeping the files safe for a friend who was working on a historical manuscript, and that he was planning to show them to Charles later in the week anyway. William didn't buy a single word of it. Instead of arguing, William did something that completely caught both Charles and Tom off guard. He pulled out his phone and called Inspector David Gallagher, the senior duty officer in charge of Royal Protection Detail for Kensington Palace. William didn't ask for advice. He gave a direct order: secure the perimeter of the courtyard lock, down the vehicle, and pull the electronic gate logs for the last 6 hours immediately. Within 10 minutes, Inspector Gallagher arrived with 2 armed officers. They ran the gate scans, and what they found completely destroyed Tom's story. The digital entry logs showed that an unrecognised civilian vehicle with private diplomatic plates had been scheduled to meet Tom's car at the rear courtyard gate at exactly 12:30 in the morning, less than 45 minutes after the discovery was made. The trunk hadn't been left open by accident. It had been popped in preparation for an active midnight handoff. The buyer was already on their way to the palace gates. William turned to his father. The charm was gone. The polite royal protocol was gone. Standing under the dim lanterns of the courtyard, with armed officers standing a few feet away, William laid down a brutal ultimatum that left King Charles completely paralysed. William looked Charles dead in the eye and said, "You either deal with this right now tonight in front of the legal team, or I walk out those gates, call a press conference tomorrow morning, and tell the world exactly what Camilla's family is doing in your house. And if you choose to protect him again, father, if you protect them over my mother, one more time you lose me permanently. You will never see my children again, and you will walk to your coronation anniversary completely alone." Think about the sheer weight of that statement. That was not a son throwing a tantrum. That was the future King of England laying out an absolute ultimatum to the reigning monarch. William put his father in an impossible position. Choose your wife's son and face an explosive public scandal that will destroy your reign or back your heir and completely dismantle Camilla's standing inside the palace. Charles stood there in complete silence, holding Diana's handwritten letter, in his shaking hands, looking at his son's cold, unyielding face. He realised in that exact moment that there was no middle ground available. There was no diplomatic compromise to be negotiated over morning tea. William had drawn a line directly through the middle of the royal family, and he was holding the legal and public detonator. Charles looked at Tom, looked back at William, and quietly whispered 3 words: "Lock the car." With those 3 words, the king officially surrendered to his heir. Security officers stepped in, impounded the vehicle, seized the folders under formal royal custody, and escorted Tom Parker Bowles off the palace grounds. The confrontation in the courtyard was over. But as dawn broke over London 6 hours later, Queen Camilla woke up to a reality that would completely shatter her world. At 6 o'clock on the morning following the banquet, a senior aide walked into Queen Camilla's private quarters at Clarence House and delivered a single devastating sentence: "The trunk was opened last night, Your Majesty. Prince William has the files." People close to the household reported that Camilla sat up in bed, clutched the edge of the silk sheets, and went completely pale. She didn't need an explanation. She didn't need to ask which files. She knew instantly that the absolute worst-case scenario had just taken place. The ghost that had haunted her entire public life for 30 years. The memory of Princess Diana had just reappeared in the hands of the one person who possessed the power to destroy her. Camilla threw on a robe, walked briskly through the stone corridors to the king's private study, and found Charles sitting by the window, looking completely drained, holding a cup of untouched tea. Tom was sitting in a chair nearby, head in his hands, looking ruined. When Camilla realised what had happened, that her son had been caught red-handed inside Buckingham Palace with Diana's private correspondence, and that William had secured the papers under military guard, she completely lost her composure. She turned on her son and shouted words that were overheard by staff in the adjoining hallway. "You absolute fool! Do you have any idea what you've done? You've destroyed everything we spent 20 years building. You've given William the exact weapon he has been waiting for his entire life." Tom tried to defend himself, repeating the line about keeping the documents safe from outside brokers. But Camilla cut him down instantly. "Safe? You brought them into Buckingham Palace in a car trunk and got caught by the king. Safe from whom, Tom? From William, from me." Then Camilla turned to Charles, her voice raw with desperation, begging him to use his royal prerogative to suppress the security logs, seal the incident under national security laws and order, William to hand the folders back to the private estate archive. She told Charles that if this story got out, it would completely destroy her public standing and ruin everything they had worked for since their wedding in 2005. She reportedly looked Charles in the eyes and said a line that chilled everyone who heard about it later. "Diana has won, Charles. Even from the grave she has won." But Charles didn't move. He sat there looking at his wife with tired, hollow eyes and gave her a devastating reality check. He told her that William was no longer asking for permission. William had already taken physical possession of the evidence, transferred the files to the secure vaults at Kensington Palace, and instructed his own legal team at Farrer and Company to prepare formal legal notices. While Camilla was panicking in Clarence House, William was executing his move with lethal professional speed. He didn't engage in emotional screaming matches with his stepmother. He didn't answer her frantic phone calls. He simply issued a strict binding directive to the Buckingham Palace press office. Any staff member who attempted to leak a defensive story or spin the courtyard incident to friendly journalists would face immediate suspension and legal prosecution under non-disclosure contracts. William completely cut off Camilla's PR channels overnight. She couldn't leak to her favourite columnists. She couldn't reframe the story as a simple misunderstanding. She was legally and institutionally trapped, and William was about to deliver a public strike that would make it impossible for anyone in the palace to pretend this was just a private family matter. 48 hours after the night of the banquet, the royal calendar called for a scheduled public appearance outside Kensington Palace. It was supposed to be a standard low-key photo opportunity, highlighting a local community initiative, the kind of event where royals shake hands with local organisers, smile for 3 minutes and drive away, while photographers take routine pictures for the morning papers. The press pack was gathered behind the velvet ropes, expecting business as usual. But when the doors of Kensington Palace opened, the atmosphere changed instantly. Prince William walked out onto the stone steps, accompanied by Catherine, Princess of Wales. There were no warm smiles for the cameras. There was no casual waving. William's face was set in stone. His shoulders were square and his jaw was locked in complete cold seriousness. Catherine stood right beside him, wearing a dark velvet coat, her expression calm, supportive, and entirely united with her husband. Instead of walking toward the waiting car, William did something that broke every single rule of royal media management. He walked straight up to the press pack, raised his right hand to command absolute silence, and looked directly into the lenses of the television cameras. The reporters went completely quiet. Nobody dared to shout a question. William spoke in a low, measured, incredibly steady voice that carried pure fire. "I am going to say this once, and I am going to say it clearly. My late mother's memory, her private correspondence, and her personal dignity belong to her sons and to history. They do not belong in the back of civilian vehicles, and they will never be bought, sold, or exploited by anyone inside or outside this palace. That boundary is now set permanently." And didn't take a single question. He didn't name Tom Parker Bowles directly. He didn't mention Camilla. He didn't have to. The message was so sharp, so transparent, and so completely unmistakable that every single journalist in that crowd knew exactly what had just happened behind closed doors. Catherine placed a quiet, gentle hand on William's arm, turned and guided him back inside the palace doors. The entire interaction took less than 90 seconds. Within 4 minutes, video clips of William's unscripted statement were blasting across international news networks. Headlines flashed across television screens in Britain, the United States, and across the globe. Prince William breaks protocol to defend Diana's legacy inside the palace. To an outsider watching the evening news, it sounded like a powerful emotional statement from a son defending his late mother. But inside the private offices of Buckingham Palace and Clarence House, that 90-second video clip landed like a megaton bomb. William had bypassed the entire royal communications apparatus, destroyed the palace's ability to cover up the courtyard discovery, and announced to the entire world that he was now running the show. Hunt didn't consult his father's advisors. He didn't ask the press office for permission. He saw an attempt to exploit his mother's legacy, and he used his public platform to obliterate the scheme in front of tens of millions of viewers. The visual statement was total. The public message was complete. But behind the scenes, the fallout from that 90-second speech was about to force King Charles into making the most humiliating choice of his entire life. The fallout from William's public statement was immediate, ruthless, and completely unstoppable. Within 3 hours of the broadcast, crowds of ordinary people began gathering outside the iron gates of Buckingham Palace and Kensington Palace. They brought flowers, handwritten notes, and vintage photographs of Princess Diana from the 1990s. The public reaction wasn't just sympathetic toward William. It turned into a wave of absolute fury, directed straight at Clarence House. Social media was completely flooded with old clips of Diana's famous interviews while royal commentators on live television openly questioned how confidential government papers detailing her life could end up in the hands of Camilla's son. Camilla's carefully constructed public image, built painstaking, brick by brick, over 20 long years, completely collapsed in less than 48 hours. Inside Clarence House, the situation was described by courtiers as complete operational paralysis. Camilla's media advisors held emergency meetings every 2 hours, trying to draft a statement that would minimize the damage. But every single draft they produced was rejected by legal counsel. They couldn't deny the existence of the letters because William held the physical folders. They couldn't claim the papers were fake because the government stamps were verified. And they couldn't blame an outside party because Tom's car had been logged by palace security. Every single exit route Camilla had relied on in past scandals was completely blocked. Meanwhile, Tom Parker Bowles was facing complete social and professional exile. The international literary agency that had been quietly organising the multi-million-pound book deal dropped the project overnight, issuing panic statements denying any formal connection to unauthorised royal archives. High-end food publications and media outlets quietly removed Tom's upcoming columns from their schedules. Prominent social clubs in London quietly let it be known that his presence would not be welcome at upcoming events. Tom went from being the charming, privileged stepson of the king to the most radioactive name in the entire United Kingdom in less than 3 days. And Camilla found herself completely isolated inside her own home. Her press contacts couldn't help her. Her advisors were powerless against William's legal blockade. And her husband was sitting in his study, completely broken by the weight of what his family had done. She had spent 2 decades outmaneuvering courtiers, managing journalists, and securing positions of comfort for her children. Within the fringes of the royal estate, she had believed that her position as queen consort made her circle untouchable. But she had miscalculated one fundamental fact. She had assumed William would prioritise family harmony over his mother's memory. She learned the hard way that William wasn't interested in maintaining a polite illusion anymore. He had waited 20 years for the right moment, and when Camilla's family made a fatal mistake, he dismantled their entire network without showing a single shred of mercy. The Parker Bowles influence inside the palace was systematically wiped out, but King Charles knew that staying quiet was no longer an option. If he wanted to save his crown from complete public rejection, he was going to have to do something no British monarch had done in modern history. On the evening of the 5th day, following the banquet discovery, King Charles walked into the main throne room at Buckingham Palace. There were no foreign dignitaries present. There were no glittering chandeliers turned on. Just a small crew of official broadcast technicians setting up live cameras under the supervision of senior palace officials. Camilla had spent the entire afternoon begging Charles not to go through with it. She told him that making a public statement would permanently validate William's version of events and destroy her standing forever. She told him it was an act of total institutional surrender. Charles looked at her with tired, sorrowful eyes and said a line that was later leaked by palace aides. "Tonight, Camilla, I am not acting as a king, protecting a court. I am acting as a broken father trying to earn back my son's trust." At 8 o'clock sharp, the live feed went out across the nation. King Charles stood before the cameras wearing a simple dark suit. He didn't read from a cold, distant state script written by government lawyers. He spoke with a trembling, deeply personal voice that stunned millions of viewers watching at home. A publicly admitted that private correspondence belonging to the late Princess Diana had been mishandled and discovered in a location where it should never have been. He didn't offer excuses. He didn't blame outside manuscript dealers. He took the entire weight of the failure directly onto his own shoulders. Looking directly into the camera lens, King Charles said, "Princess Diana was the mother of my children. Her memory, her private reflections, and her enduring legacy deserve nothing less than total respect, total protection, and absolute sanctity. Any failure by this household, or those connected to it, to safeguard her memory is my burden, and my burden alone. I ask the public for understanding, and I ask my son for forgiveness." The nation was completely stunned into silence. It was an unprecedented moment in modern constitutional history. A reigning British monarch standing before his people on live television, taking personal responsibility for a family failure and publicly asking his heir for forgiveness. And Charles didn't stop there. Immediately following the broadcast, the palace released an official legal decree signed by the king under the Crown Private Estates Act. Under the terms of that decree, every single document, letter, diary, and personal artifact belonging to Princess Diana that existed within royal estates was permanently transferred into a newly created legal structure, the Diana Personal Archive Trust. The sole trustee, with exclusive administrative, legal, and editorial authority, was designated as Prince William, Prince of Wales. No other royal household, no extended family member, and specifically, no member of the Parker Bowles line would ever be granted access, viewing rights, or inventory control over those papers ever again. It was a total, absolute legal closure. William had secured complete permanent control over his mother's physical legacy. Tom Parker Bowles was formally stripped of his palace access passes. Camilla's family was permanently removed from official royal guest lists, and the files were locked inside the high-security archives at Kensington Palace under William's personal key. It was over. The victory was total. But as the cameras were packed away in the throne room, the larger realization of what had just happened began to settle over the British monarchy. When you step back from the dramatic Midnight Discovery, the open car trunk, the frantic palace confrontations, and the live television broadcasts, you realize that we didn't just witness a family argument over a folder of old letters. We witnessed the official, irreversible arrival of Prince William's era. For years, the public narrative around the British royal family was that King Charles would rule as a steady, gentle bridge between the old Elizabethan age and the modern world, managing complicated domestic dynamics with soft compromises and keeping everyone happy behind closed doors. But this crisis proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the era of soft compromise is officially dead. Charles may still wear the physical crown. He may still sit on the throne during state openings of Parliament, and his face may appear on the currency. But everyone inside the British establishment now knows that when actual institutional power is tested, it is Prince William who holds the real leverage, the willingness to act decisively, and the absolute support of the public. And didn't wait for a committee to resolve the crisis. He didn't allow courtiers to draft a polite cover story. He saw a threat to his mother's memory and his family's integrity, and he used every legal, institutional, and media weapon available to eliminate that threat in broad daylight. And think about what this means for the memory of Princess Diana. For nearly 30 years, the story of Diana was framed as a tragic tale about a young woman who entered a cold, rigid institution, was stripped of her royal standing, and was gradually marginalised, while the people who caused her pain moved into the grandest rooms of the royal estate. But William's counterattack flipped that historic narrative forever by seizing total legal control over her private archives and forcing the king to make a public confession on national television. William used the very same institutional authority that once marginalised his mother to place her legacy at the absolute centre of the monarchy's future. Camilla's circle operated on the comfortable assumption that William was still that compliant teenager who would swallow his anger to avoid making a scene. They learned the hard way that the boy who walked behind his mother's coffin is now a formidable, hyper-focused leader who will dismantle anyone who tries to exploit her memory. On the night following the king's historic broadcast, Catherine, Princess of Wales, wrote a simple, profound reflection in her private personal journal that was later shared with close confidants. She wrote about watching her husband stand by the window of their home, looking out over the quiet gardens of Kensington Palace after the storm had finally passed. She wrote, "The world sees the power of the crown, but they do not see the weight it carries." William did not fight this battle for power or for titles. He fought it for a promise he made to his mother when he was 15 years old. The crown is not a prize to be won. It is a heavy burden to be carried with honour, and those who treat it like a private commodity will always be broken by its weight. The trunk is now closed. The letters are safely locked in a high-security vault. The Parker Bowles family has been pushed back into the margins, and Queen Camilla continues her public duties beside the king in total disciplined silence. The monarchy survived the speech, the headlines, and the night, but the quiet war between the son who remembers and the crown that tried to forget is only just getting started.